Welcome, dear friends, to a heartwarming tale of compassion and redemption. Enjoy the story. Sarah limped down the sterile hospital corridor, her mop leaving wet streaks on the linoleum floor. The harsh fluorescent lights cast unflattering shadows on her plain face, accentuating the deep-set worry lines etched around her eyes. At 32, Sarah looked much older, worn down by years of hardship and the constant struggle to fit in. As she approached the nurse's station, Dr. Michael Stevens, the chief of staff, emerged from his office. His expensive Italian loafers squeaked on the freshly mopped floor, and his face contorted into a scowl. "Sarah, what the hell is this bucket doing in the middle of the hallway? It's a safety hazard," he barked, gesturing dramatically at the metal bucket nestled safely against the wall. Sarah's shoulders slumped as she turned to face her boss. "I'm sorry, Dr. Stevens. I'll move it right away." "Not right away. Now!" Dr. Stevens snapped, his face reddening. "You're always causing problems, Sarah. I swear, sometimes I think you're more trouble than you're worth." As Dr. Stevens stormed off, Nurse Jenny approached Sarah with a sympathetic smile. "Don't let him get to you, hun. He's just in one of his moods again." Sarah forced a weak smile. "Thanks, Jenny. I just wish I knew why he's always picking on me." But deep down, Sarah knew exactly why Dr. Stevens had it out for her. She was the keeper of his dirty little secret, a secret that could destroy his career and reputation if it ever got out. 3 months earlier, Sarah had been working late, cleaning the administrative offices. She thought everyone had gone home for the night when she heard voices coming from Dr. Stevens' office. Curious, she crept closer to the door, which had been left slightly ajar. Inside, she saw Dr. Stevens with a woman she didn't recognize. The woman's voice was urgent, pleading. "Please, Dr. Stevens, my son made a terrible mistake. He was driving drunk and hit someone. I need your help." Sarah's heart raced as she listened to Dr. Stevens agree to falsify medical records in exchange for a hefty bribe. As the woman left, Sarah tried to slip away unnoticed, but Dr. Stevens caught her. His eyes narrowed dangerously as he hissed, "If you breathe a word of this to anyone, you'll be out on the street so fast your head will spin. Understand?" Sarah had nodded mutely, scurrying away as fast as her bad leg would allow. Since that night, Dr. Stevens had made her life a living hell, constantly berating her and threatening her job for the smallest infractions. As Sarah finished mopping the floor, she couldn't help but wonder how her life had come to this. She'd always been different, set apart by the pronounced limp she'd had since childhood. Her parents, more concerned with their next drink than their daughter's well-being, had never bothered to get her the surgery that could have corrected her gait. Growing up, Sarah had been a loner, friendless, and isolated. She threw herself into her studies, earning top grades, but college was never an option. Instead, she'd found herself trapped in a cycle of poverty and low-wage jobs, struggling to make ends meet. When her parents died in a house fire caused by their own drunken carelessness, Sarah had been left truly alone in the world. She'd fought tooth and nail for the dilapidated little house the city had grudgingly provided her, and she'd poured her heart and soul into making it a home. As her shift ended, Sarah made her way to the hospital's small courtyard. It was her favorite place to unwind after a long day, a quiet oasis where she could sit on a bench and let her imagination run wild. In her daydreams, she wasn't the limping janitor everyone overlooked. She was beautiful, successful, and loved. The cool night air caressed her face as she settled onto her usual bench. Sarah closed her eyes, savoring the peace and quiet. Tomorrow was her day off, and she looked forward to tending her small vegetable garden, the one thing in her life that truly brought her joy. Just as she was about to head home, a low moan caught her attention. Sarah's eyes snapped open, scanning the darkness. There, on the ground near another bench, lay a man. He was clutching his side and groaning in pain. Without hesitation, Sarah rushed to his side. "Sir, are you all right? What's wrong?" The man looked up at her with pain-filled eyes. I don't know. My side, it hurts so bad. I was trying to make it to the hospital, but I couldn't." Sarah helped the man to his feet, noticing as she did so that despite his ragged appearance, he wasn't as old as she'd first thought. Under the dirt and scraggly beard, She could see a face that was probably close to her own age. "I'm Sarah. I work here at the hospital. Let's get you inside and have someone take a look at you, okay?" The man nodded gratefully. "Thank you. I'm Nick." As Sarah helped Nick into the emergency room, she saw the looks of disgust on the faces of the staff. Ignoring them, she guided Nick to a chair and went to speak with the intake nurse. "Excuse me, this man needs help. He's in a lot of pain." The nurse barely glanced up from her computer. "Fill out these forms and wait to be called." Sarah bit back a retort and returned to Nick with the clipboard. As she helped him fill out the paperwork, she couldn't help but notice how his eyes kept darting around nervously, as if he expected to be thrown out at any moment. "It's okay," she reassured him. "They'll take care of you here." Nick gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thanks. I haven't had much kindness lately." Before Sarah could respond, a harried-looking doctor approached them. "What seems to be the problem?" Nick described his symptoms, and the doctor's expression grew serious. "Sounds like appendicitis. We need to get you into surgery right away." As they wheeled Nick away, Sarah felt a strange tugging in her chest. She hoped he would be okay. Little did she know, this chance encounter was about to change both their lives forever. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital early, eager to check on Nick before her shift started. She found him recovering in a small room, looking much better than he had the night before. "Sarah." Nick's face lit up when he saw her. "I was hoping you'd come by. I wanted to thank you for helping me last night. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me." Sarah felt a warm glow in her chest at his words. It wasn't often that anyone noticed her, let alone thanked her. "I'm just glad you're okay. How are you feeling?" "Much better," Nick replied. "The doctor said I was lucky. If I'd waited much longer, my appendix might have burst." As they chatted, Sarah found herself drawn to Nick's kind eyes and easy smile. Despite his obvious hardships, there was a gentleness about him that she found comforting. Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by the sound of angry shouting in the hallway. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized Dr. Stevens' voice. "Where is she? Where's that useless janitor?" Sarah stood up, her legs shaking. "I'm sorry, I have to go. I'll try to check on you later." Before Nick could respond, Dr. Stevens burst into the room, his face purple with rage. "There you are! What the hell do you think you're doing bringing homeless bums into my hospital?" Sarah flinched at his harsh words. "Dr. Stevens, he needed help. He had appendicitis." "I don't care if he was dying in the street," Dr. Stevens roared. "You've crossed a line this time, Sarah. You're fired. Get your things and get out, and take your vagrant friend with you." Sarah stood there stunned. But you can't just throw him out. He's recovering from surgery." Dr. Stevens sneered. "Watch me. Security will be here in 5 minutes to escort both of you off the premises. If you're not gone by then, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." With that, he stormed out of the room, leaving Sarah and Nick in shocked silence. Nick was the first to speak. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." Sarah shook her head, fighting back tears. "No, it's not your fault. Dr. Stevens has had it out for me for a long time. This was just the excuse he was looking for." As the reality of her situation sank in, Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. She'd lost her job. How would she pay her bills? How would she survive? Nick struggled to sit up in bed. "Sarah, what are you going to do?" She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "I don't know, but first we need to get you out of here. Can you walk?" Nick nodded hesitantly. "I think so, if I take it slow." Sarah helped Nick out of bed and gathered his few belongings. As they made their way slowly down the hall, she could feel the stares and whispers of her former coworkers. Head held high, she guided Nick to the exit, where a taxi was waiting. As they settled into the back seat, Nick turned to her with worried eyes. "Where are we going?" Sarah gave the driver her address before turning back to Nick. "My place. It's not much, but you need somewhere to recover, and I can't leave you on the street." Nick's eyes widened. "Sarah, you don't have to do that. You've already lost your job because of me. I can't impose on you any further." Sarah managed a small smile. "It's okay, Nick. Right now, I think we both need a friend." As the taxi pulled away from the hospital, Sarah felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel quite so alone. The taxi pulled up to Sarah's small weathered house on the outskirts of town. As they made their way up the cracked concrete path, Sarah couldn't help but feel a twinge of embarrassment at the peeling paint and overgrown yard. "It's not much," she said apologetically as she helped Nick through the door. "But it's home." Nick's eyes roamed around the small living room, taking in the mismatched furniture and the vase of wildflowers on the coffee table. "It's lovely," he said sincerely. "Thank you for bringing me here." Sarah helped Nick settle onto the worn but comfortable couch. "You should rest. I'll make us some tea." As she busied herself in the tiny kitchen, Sarah's mind raced. What was she thinking, bringing a stranger into her home? But as she glanced back at Nick, who was gingerly touching his bandaged side, she knew she couldn't have done anything else. Returning with 2 steaming mugs, Sarah handed one to Nick and settled into the armchair across from him. An awkward silence fell between them. Finally, Nick spoke. "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for me, Sarah, but I feel terrible about you losing your job. If there's anything I can do to help..." Sarah shook her head. "You need to focus on recovering. I'll figure something out." As they sipped their tea, Sarah found herself opening up to Nick in a way she never had with anyone before. She told him about her childhood, her parents' neglect, and the loneliness that had been her constant companion. Nick listened attentively, his eyes filled with compassion. When she finished, he reached out and gently took her hand. "I'm so sorry you've had to go through all that, Sarah. You deserved better." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes at his kindness. "What about you?" she asked, eager to change the subject. "How did you end up, well, homeless?" Nick finished with a wry smile. He took a deep breath before continuing. "It's a long story, but the short version is that I caught my wife cheating on me with my best friend. I was so angry and hurt that I started drinking. Before I knew it, I'd lost my job, my house, everything." Sarah squeezed his hand sympathetically. "That's awful, Nick. I'm so sorry." Nick shrugged. "It was my own fault. I let the anger consume me instead of dealing with it. But being on the streets, it changes you, makes you realize what's really important in life." As they continued to talk, Sarah felt a warmth growing in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen and heard by another person. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Sarah opened it to find her nosy neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, peering over her shoulder. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Thompson said in a sugary voice that didn't match her narrowed eyes. "I couldn't help but notice you bringing a gentleman caller home. Is everything all right?" Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Thompson. My friend Nick is recovering from surgery and needed a place to stay. Not that it's any of your business." Mrs. Thompson's eyebrows shot up at Sarah's uncharacteristically sharp tone. "Well, I was just concerned, that's all. We don't need any troublemakers in the neighborhood." "The only trouble here is nosy neighbors who don't mind their own business," Sarah snapped, surprising herself with her boldness. "Good day, Mrs. Thompson." She closed the door on the sputtering woman and turned back to Nick, who was struggling not to laugh. "I'm sorry about that," Sarah said, her cheek still burning. "Mrs. Thompson likes to keep tabs on everyone in the neighborhood." Nick grinned at her. "Don't apologize, that was amazing. I don't think I've ever seen anyone shut down a busybody so effectively." As they laughed together, Sarah felt an unfamiliar sensation bubbling up inside her. It took her a moment to recognize it as happiness. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah felt like she had a real friend. And as she looked at Nick's smiling face, she couldn't help but wonder if perhaps he could become even more than that. The days that followed fell into a comfortable routine. Sarah tended to Nick's wound, changing his bandages and making sure he took his medication. In return, Nick insisted on helping around the house as much as his recovering body would allow. One afternoon, about a week after Nick's arrival, Sarah came home from a disappointing job search to find him in the backyard, examining her rickety old fence. "What are you doing?" she asked, setting down her purse. Nick turned to her with a smile. I was thinking this fence could use some repair. I noticed you have some tools in the shed. If you'd like, I could fix it up for you. Sarah hesitated. That's very kind of you, Nick, but you're still recovering. I don't want you to strain yourself. Nonsense, Nick replied. The doctor said light activity would be good for me. Besides, it's the least I can do to repay your kindness. Over the next few days, Nick threw himself into repairing the fence. Sarah watched in amazement as he skillfully replaced rotted boards and reinforced weak spots. By the time he was finished, the fence looked better than it had in years. Nick, this is incredible, Sarah said, running her hand along the smooth, freshly painted wood. Where did you learn to do this? Nick's eyes took on a faraway look. My dad was a carpenter. He taught me everything he knew. I used to love working with him before. Before what? Sarah prompted gently. Nick sighed. Before I threw it all away for a corporate job that I hated. I thought I needed to wear a suit and sit behind a desk to be successful. Turns out, I was happiest when I was building things with my hands. Sarah nodded in understanding. It's never too late to start over, you know. Nick gave her a small smile. Maybe you're right. As the weeks passed, Nick's health improved, and so did Sarah's little house. He fixed leaky faucets, patched holes in the walls, and even built a charming window box for Sarah's flowers. The house was slowly transforming, much like the relationship between its two occupants. Sarah found herself looking forward to coming home each day, eager to see what new improvements Nick had made to the house. More than that, she longed for their evening conversations, where they shared their hopes, fears, and dreams. One night, as they sat on the newly repaired porch swing, Sarah turned to Nick with a serious expression. Nick, I've been meaning to ask you something. Nick set down his iced tea and gave her his full attention. What is it, Sarah? She took a deep breath. I've noticed how much you enjoy working on the house. Have you ever thought about turning it into a career? Maybe starting your own handyman business? Nick's eyes widened in surprise. I hadn't really considered it. Do you think I could? Sarah nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely. You're incredibly skilled, Nick. And I've seen how happy you are when you're working with your hands. I think you'd be amazing at it. A slow smile spread across Nick's face. You know, that's not a bad idea. But, his smile faltered, who would hire someone like me? I don't exactly have the best track record. Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand. You've made mistakes, Nick, but that doesn't define who you are. I've seen the real you over these past weeks. You're kind, hardworking, and talented. Any client would be lucky to have you. Nick's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Thank you, Sarah. Your belief in me, it means more than you know. As they sat there, hands clasped and hearts full, Sarah realized that something had shifted between them. The air seemed charged with possibility, and she found herself leaning closer to Nick, drawn by an invisible force. Just as their lips were about to meet, a car horn blared in the distance, shattering the moment. They jumped apart, both blushing furiously. I should probably get some sleep, Nick stammered, rising from the swing. Big day tomorrow if I'm going to start planning this business. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. Right, of course. Good night, Nick. As she watched him disappear into the house, Sarah touched her fingers to her lips, wondering what might have happened if they hadn't been interrupted. The next morning, Sarah awoke to the sound of hammering. She found Nick in the backyard, constructing a small workbench out of scrap wood. What's all this? She asked, handing him a cup of coffee. Nick grinned up at her, his eyes shining with excitement. I couldn't sleep last night. I kept thinking about what you said, about starting my own business, so I figured I'd get a head start. Sarah beamed at him, her heart swelling with pride. That's wonderful, Nick. Is there anything I can do to help? Together, they spent the day brainstorming ideas for Nick's new handyman business. Sarah used her old laptop to help him create flyers and a simple website, while Nick made a list of all the services he could offer. As they worked, Sarah couldn't help but notice how alive Nick looked. His eyes sparkled with purpose, and there was a spring in his step that hadn't been there before. You know, Nick said as they took a break for lunch, I never thought I'd feel this way again. Excited about the future, I mean. Sarah smiled softly at him. I know exactly what you mean. It's like the world is full of possibilities again. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with unspoken emotions. But before either of them could act on it, Sarah's phone rang, breaking the spell. It was the hospital administration office. Sarah listened intently, her expression changing from confusion to shock. What is it? Nick asked as she hung up. Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide. That was the hospital. They want me to come in for a meeting tomorrow. Something about discussing recent events. Nick's brow furrowed with concern. Do you think it has something to do with Dr. Stevens? Sarah shrugged helplessly. I don't know, but I guess I'll find out tomorrow. That night, Sarah tossed and turned, her mind racing with possibilities. What if Dr. Stevens had told more lies about her? What if they were planning to press charges for helping Nick? By the time morning came, she was a bundle of nerves. Nick insisted on driving her to the hospital in Sarah's old car. As they pulled up to the entrance, he turned to her with a reassuring smile. No matter what happens in there, Sarah, remember that you did the right thing. And I'll be right here waiting for you. Sarah nodded gratefully, drawing strength from his words. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and walked into the hospital, her head held high. To her surprise, she was led not to the administration offices, but to the boardroom. As she entered, she found herself face to face with not only the hospital administrator, but also several members of the board of directors. Miss Walker, the administrator began, we've asked you here today to discuss the events surrounding your dismissal from St. Mary's Hospital. Sarah's heart raced as she prepared to defend herself. But what came next shocked her to her core. It has come to our attention that your termination was the result of a grievous error in judgment on the part of Dr. Michael Stevens. The administrator continued, we have conducted a thorough investigation and uncovered numerous instances of misconduct, including the incident you witnessed involving falsified medical records. Sarah's jaw dropped. You know about that? One of the board members nodded gravely. Dr. Stevens's actions have brought shame upon this institution. He has been terminated from his position and may face criminal charges. The administrator leaned forward, his expression softening. Miss Walker, on behalf of St. Mary's Hospital, I want to offer you our sincerest apologies for the treatment you endured. We would like to offer you your job back, with a substantial raise and a promotion to head of custodial services. Sarah sat there stunned. She had never imagined this outcome in her wildest dreams. As the reality of the situation sank in, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She was vindicated. She was valued. With tears in her eyes, Sarah looked at the expectant faces around her. Thank you for this opportunity, she said, her voice strong and clear, but I'm afraid I'll have to decline. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. The administrator looked taken aback. Miss Walker, I assure you, the raise is quite generous. Sarah held up a hand, silencing him. It's not about the money. These past few weeks have shown me that there's more to life than just surviving. I've discovered new possibilities, new dreams, and I think it's time I pursued them. As she walked out of the hospital, her head held high, Sarah felt like a new woman. Nick was waiting for her in the car, his face etched with concern. How did it go? He asked anxiously as she slid into the passenger seat. Sarah turned to him, a bright smile illuminating her face. Nick, how would you feel about having a partner in your new business venture? Nick's eyes widened in surprise, then crinkled with joy. Sarah, are you serious? You really want to work with me? She nodded, her heart full of excitement and hope. I've spent my whole life feeling invisible, Nick. But with you, I feel seen, I feel valued, and I think together we could build something amazing. Nick reached out and took her hand, intertwining their fingers. I think you're right, he said softly. And this time, when he leaned in to kiss her, there were no interruptions. Over the next few months, Sarah and Nick threw themselves into building their new business, Second Chance Renovations. They started small, taking on odd jobs and minor repairs for neighbors and friends of friends. Word of mouth spread quickly, and soon they found themselves with a growing list of clients. Sarah discovered she had a knack for organization and customer relations, while Nick's skills with tools and building continued to impress everyone they worked for. They made a perfect team, both in business and in life. One evening, as they sat at their kitchen table reviewing their finances, Nick let out a low whistle. "Sarah, do you realize we've made more in the past 3 months than I used to make in a year at my corporate job?" Sarah looked up from her laptop, her eyes wide. "Really? That's incredible." Nick nodded, a proud smile on his face. "And it's all thanks to you. If you hadn't believed in me, hadn't pushed me to start this business, I'd probably still be on the streets." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "We did this together, Nick. You've changed my life just as much as I've changed yours." As they gazed into each other's eyes, Nick suddenly stood up and pulled Sarah to her feet. "Come with me. I want to show you something." He led her out to the backyard, where a large object stood covered by a tarp. With a flourish, Nick pulled the tarp away, revealing a beautifully crafted wooden gazebo. Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Nick, it's beautiful! When did you do this?" Nick smiled sheepishly. "I've been working on it in secret for weeks. I wanted it to be perfect." As Sarah walked around the gazebo, admiring the intricate details and sturdy construction, Nick cleared his throat nervously. "Sarah," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "these past few months have been the happiest of my life. You saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. You gave me a second chance when I thought I didn't deserve one." Sarah turned to face him, her heart pounding as she realized what was happening. Nick slowly lowered himself to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "Sarah Walker," he said, his eyes shining with love and unshed tears. "Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she nodded vigorously. "Yes, Nick, yes, I'll marry you." As Nick slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple but elegant diamond that he had saved for months to buy, Sarah felt like her heart might burst with happiness. They sealed their engagement with a kiss, standing in the gazebo that would forever symbolize their love and the life they had built together. 5 years later. The sound of children's laughter filled the air as Sarah and Nick stood on their front porch, watching their 4-year-old twins, Emma and Ethan, play in the yard. The once dilapidated house had been transformed into a warm and inviting home, a testament to their hard work and love. "Mommy, Daddy, look!" Emma called out, pointing to a butterfly that had landed on a nearby flower. Sarah smiled, leaning into Nick's embrace. "Can you believe how far we've come?" she mused. Nick kissed the top of her head. "Sometimes I still think I'm dreaming, but then I look at you and our children, and I know this is real. This is the life we built together." As they stood there, enjoying the perfect moment, a sleek SUV pulled up in front of their house. A well-dressed couple stepped out, looking around appreciatively. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson?" Sarah called out, descending the porch steps to greet them. "Welcome to Second Chance Renovations. We're so excited to discuss your home remodeling project." As Nick joined her, shaking hands with their potential new clients, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at the journey that had brought them to this point. From a chance encounter in a hospital courtyard to building a thriving business and a loving family, they had truly created their own happily ever after. Later that night, as they tucked the twins into bed, Emma looked up at Sarah with curious eyes. "Mommy, why do you walk funny sometimes?" Sarah exchanged a glance with Nick before sitting on the edge of Emma's bed. "Well, sweetie, Mommy had an accident when she was little that made her leg a little different. But you know what? It doesn't stop me from doing anything I want to do." Nick sat down next to her, adding, "That's right. Your mom is the strongest, bravest person I know. And do you know what else? It's our differences that make us special." As they turned out the lights and closed the children's bedroom door, Sarah pulled Nick into a tight embrace. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" Nick asked, stroking her hair. "For loving all of me," Sarah replied. "For seeing past my limp and loving me for who I am." Nick tilted her chin up, looking deep into her eyes. "Sarah, your limp is part of who you are, and I love every part of you. It's a reminder of how strong you are, of everything you've overcome. You're perfect just the way you are." As they shared a tender kiss, Sarah knew that she had found not just love, but true acceptance. In Nick's arms, in the home they had built together, and in the family they had created, Sarah had finally found where she belonged. And as for Dr. Stevens, the last they heard, he was serving time for medical fraud, a cautionary tale of how corruption and cruelty ultimately lead to downfall. But for Sarah and Nick, his actions had set in motion a chain of events that led to their happiness. In the end, love, compassion, and second chances had triumphed over bitterness and deceit. As they fell asleep that night, wrapped in each other's arms, Sarah and Nick were grateful for every step of their journey, even the painful ones that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment.